God help us! The desperate radio call crackled through the static as the surrounded SEALs looked up at the ridge. Then her red dot appeared, changing everything in an instant. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Lieutenant Marcus Ellison felt the jolt of his parachute opening as he descended through the darkening Albanian sky. The silk canopy whispered above him, a sound nearly lost in the frigid mountain wind. 5 other shadows fell alongside him, his SEAL team, each man a silent ghost against the twilight. Landing in 30, Marcus whispered into his comm device. The response was static, their first warning sign. Their boots hit the thawing mountain soil with practiced precision, but the usual relief of touchdown was absent. Something felt wrong. Marcus scanned the jagged horizon as his team quickly gathered their chutes, efficiency born from years of training. Comms compromise. Petty Officer Neil Jordan muttered, adjusting dials on their radio with gloved fingers. The man everyone called Blaze for his red hair and explosive personality kept his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed concern. Marcus nodded grimly. The encrypted landing coordinates had been secure, or should have been. Someone within the NATO infrastructure had leaked their arrival. The team's initial confidence wavered as they detected movement in the tree line where no movement should be. Defensive positions, he ordered, his breath forming clouds in the mountain air. The distant echo of gunfire carried across the valley, another bad sign. This extraction mission was already going sideways. 3 miles north along the Highland Trail, Alira Dresche paused her solitary supply run. The former sniper adjusted her worn jacket against the biting cold, her instincts still sharp despite years away from combat. Something had disturbed the usual rhythm of the mountains. Alira reached for her battered binoculars, scanning the slopes below. Her breath caught in her throat. 6 figures in tactical gear moved with military precision across terrain they clearly didn't know. Americans, judging by their equipment. SEALs, based on their formation. Then she saw him, Marcus. Even at this distance, she would recognize that purposeful stride anywhere. The team leader moved with the same controlled urgency she remembered from their NATO training years ago. Not now, she whispered, lowering the binoculars with trembling hands. Not here. Storm clouds gathered overhead, mirroring the turmoil in her chest. She had built a new life in these mountains, far from violence and military operations, far from him and the memories that haunted her. Yet here he was, bringing danger back to her doorstep. Alira tucked the binoculars away and pulled her hood tighter. The old ache of unfinished business stirred within her. Questions never answered, words never spoken. She knew these mountains better than any foreign soldier ever could. If Marcus and his team had been compromised, they wouldn't survive the night without help. She hesitated, watching as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Whatever had brought the SEALs to northern Albania, it couldn't be good, and whatever peace Alira had found in these mountains was about to be shattered. The sudden storm descended upon the mountains with a fury that seemed almost personal. Sheets of rain lashed against Lieutenant Marcus Ellison's face as he squinted at the darkening sky, watching their aerial support vanish behind dense cloud cover. The drone's feed had cut out 3 minutes ago, leaving the SEAL team effectively blind from above. "Comms are going down," Marcus shouted over the howling wind, rainwater streaming from his helmet. The old radio in his hand crackled with static, occasional fragments of words breaking through before dissolving into white noise. Their satellite phones fared no better, the storm blocking signals that normally penetrated the most hostile environments. Blaze wiped rain from his eyes, his usual smile replaced by grim determination. "Maps are useless in this," he said, gesturing to the sodden paper disintegrating in his hands. The ink ran in blue rivulets between his fingers, washing away paths and landmarks they desperately needed. Each step forward became a calculated risk. The team moved in tight formation, boots sliding on mud that seemed to grow deeper by the minute. What had been solid ground hours earlier now threatened to swallow their ankles. The mountain itself becoming an enemy as treacherous as any human adversary. Miles below, General Nikola Shkodra stood beneath a canvas tarp, watching the storm with cold satisfaction. The weather that hampered the Americans would be his ally. The paramilitary leader adjusted his rain-slick jacket, nodding to his lieutenants as they deployed portable jamming devices across the lower valleys. "They are blind now," Shkodra said in Albanian, his voice barely audible above the storm. "And we are the wolves who hunt in darkness." His men moved with practiced efficiency, their knowledge of every ridge and gully giving them advantages no foreign training could match. They had grown up climbing these slopes, knew which paths would flood first, which rocky outcroppings offered the best cover. The general's forces spread through the valleys like water itself, flowing around obstacles, converging where resistance was weakest. A thunderclap rolled across the mountains, its echo lingering in the valleys. In its wake came the sharp report of a rifle, then another. The storm swallowed these sounds, making it impossible to gauge distance or direction. Every lightning flash illuminated the landscape for precious seconds, revealing shadows moving where none should be. In a small shepherd's hut halfway up the eastern slope, Elira Dreshaw pressed her back against rough wooden planks, listening to the chaos outside. Her fingers traced the outline of the communication device hidden in her pocket, useless now in the electromagnetic interference. She knew what the Americans couldn't. In these mountains, technology always failed before nature and tradition. The storm was gathering in more ways than one. As thunder rolled again across the peaks, Elira closed her eyes, counting the seconds until the inevitable flash of lightning. When it came, it revealed a world transformed by water and shadow, where old enemies and new allies were equally difficult to distinguish. The pre-dawn mist clung to the Albanian mountains like a shroud as Lieutenant Marcus Ellison signaled his team forward. Their boots sank into the mud, each step releasing the earthy scent of thawing soil. The storm had passed, but its aftermath made their progress treacherous. "Clear," whispered Marcus, scanning the ridge through his scope. The team advanced in practiced formation until a muffled click froze them in place. Petty Officer Neil Blaze Jordan's eyes widened. The controlled detonation they'd planned went off prematurely, sending him sprawling. The explosion wasn't large, but the impact twisted his leg at an unnatural angle. "Perimeter secure," Marcus ordered, as two SEALs immediately took defensive positions. He crouched beside Blaze, whose face had gone ashen. "How bad?" "Just a scratch, boss," Blaze quipped through gritted teeth. Though everyone could see the fractured bone threatening to break skin, the sailor attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Might need to postpone my dancing career." Their medic worked quickly, stabilizing the fracture with a field splint. "He can't walk on this," he concluded, voice low. Marcus nodded grimly. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from tactical gear, slowing their advance to a crawl. The added burden forced them to abandon their original timeline. Lyra Krasniki watched the Americans struggle, her dark eyes revealing nothing. "There is a faster route," she finally offered, pointing toward a narrow gorge cutting between two sheer rock faces. "It will save 3 hours." The guide's suggestion was met with skepticism. Marcus studied her face. Searching for deception, Lyra had been assigned through NATO channels, but something in her manner had always seemed reserved, calculating. "We'll take it," he decided, having little choice. The gorge proved even more treacherous than the main path. Twice, Lyra stopped them with a raised hand, pointing out nearly invisible tripwires. "Old traps," she explained, "from many conflicts." What she didn't tell them was that some were much newer. Her brother Arbin's unit had laid them just days ago under Shkodra's orders. Each trap she revealed was a betrayal of her blood, yet each she concealed was a betrayal of these men who trusted her. As they navigated a particularly narrow section, Blaze bit back a cry of pain when his stretcher jostled against the rock wall. "If I'd known tourism in Albania was this exciting," he joked weakly, "I'd have brought better shoes." Lyra's satellite phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from her brother's captors, no doubt. Another demand, another threat. She glanced back at the wounded American, his humor masking suffering, then at Marcus, whose eyes never stopped scanning for danger. These men were not her enemy. Yet with every step, she guided them forward. Her brother's life hung in the balance on the other side of these mountains. Lyra's hand trembled slightly as she pointed out the next safe passage, wondering which of her loyalties would ultimately cost more blood. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain clinic as Arta Dreshai moved quietly between makeshift beds. Her patients, mostly refugees from nearby villages, slept fitfully as she packed her medical bag with antibiotics and painkillers. The supplies were dwindling faster than expected, and the nearest replenishment point was a 3-hour trek through territory increasingly patrolled by General Shkodra's men. "I'll be back before nightfall," she whispered to her assistant, a local woman whose son had been saved by Arta's surgical skills last winter. The doctor slipped out the back entrance, her path winding through pine forests still wet with dew. She never made it to her destination. 2 miles from the clinic, 3 armed men emerged from behind a cluster of boulders. Arta recognized one of them, a former patient whose leg she had saved from amputation. The shame in his eyes told her everything before they even bound her wrists. "The general wants to speak with you personally," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "He knows about your NATO connections." Word of her capture spread through the highlands like wildfire. Families who had sheltered wounded resistance fighters began burning evidence of their involvement. The fragile network of safe houses and supply routes that Arta had carefully cultivated over 3 years began to unravel thread by thread. 50 miles away, Elira Dreshai was collecting wild herbs when a breathless shepherd boy delivered the news. Her cousin, her only remaining family, was now in Shkodra's custody. The boy described how Arta had been marched through a village square, head held high, despite her bound hands. "They're taking her to the old military compound," the boy said, accepting Elira's payment of bread and cheese. "They say she's been helping NATO spies." That night, as clouds gathered over the mountains, Elira stood before a stone cross weathered by decades of Albanian winters. She had chosen this remote spot 3 years ago, after vowing never again to take a life. Now her trembling fingers dug into the cold earth beneath the cross, unearthing a waterproof case. Inside lay her past, a disassembled sniper rifle, ammunition, and a scope with a distinctive red dot sight. Each piece she removed from the case felt heavier than she remembered. The metal was cold against her skin as she began cleaning components that had lain dormant for years. "I promised," she whispered to the empty night, her voice catching. "I promised I would never become that person again." But as she assembled the weapon with muscle memory that had never faded, Elira knew some promises couldn't be kept when family was at stake. The rifle, complete once more, gleamed dully in the moonlight, a ghost from her former life resurrected by necessity and blood ties. The crumbling safe house stood like a forgotten sentinel at the village's edge. Its stone walls, pockmarked with bullet holes from conflicts long past, offered little comfort to the exhausted SEALs who had taken refuge inside. Lieutenant Marcus Ellison pressed his back against the cold wall, straining to hear any sound that might indicate rescue was coming. The fading daylight filtered through cracks in the boarded windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. "We've got 3 possible routes," Neil Blaze Jordan muttered, his pencil scratching frantically across the pages of his notebook. Despite the pain from his fractured leg, the officer maintained his characteristic focus. "But I don't like any of them." Marcus nodded grimly. "How's the ammo count?" 27 rounds total," replied one of the team members, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not enough if they come in force." The lieutenant ran his hand through his dirt-streaked hair. Their extraction window was narrowing by the minute, and the communication device had fallen silent hours ago. The smoky twilight inside the safe house grew thicker with tension as each man contemplated their dwindling options. "We should have listened to Lyra," Blaze said, glancing toward the door where they'd last seen their guide before she'd vanished to scout ahead. The team's trust in her had been wavering, her divided loyalties a constant source of concern. A sudden crack shattered the silence. Marcus dropped to his knees, crawling toward the window. "Contact, east side," he hissed. Outside, shadows moved between the trees. General Nikola Shkodra's forces had found them. The first burst of gunfire tore through the rotting wooden door, sending splinters flying across the room. The SEALs took defensive positions, their training overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze them. "Conserve ammo," Marcus ordered as he returned fire in controlled bursts. 3-second intervals. Bullets ricocheted off the rusted metal beams supporting the ceiling, raining dust and debris onto the men below. The extraction window that had been their last hope was closing rapidly. Each passing minute diminished their chances of survival. Blaze dragged himself behind an overturned table, grimacing through the pain. "Any word from command?" he shouted over the deafening exchange. Marcus shook his head, his face illuminated briefly by muzzle flashes. The communication device remained silent, a dead weight in his pocket. Outside, more vehicles arrived, their engines growling in the gathering darkness. The paramilitary forces were establishing a perimeter, cutting off all escape routes. As night fell completely, the lieutenant looked at his men, their determined faces, their dwindling ammunition, their fading hope. The safe house had become a trap, and they all knew it. The extraction that should have happened hours ago now seemed like a distant dream as bullets continued to tear through their fragile shelter. The silence was absolute. For one breathless moment, the gunfire ceased, and in that fragile pocket of quiet, Blaze's ragged whisper carried across the room, "God help us." The words hung in the smoky air of the safe house, more desperate plea than prayer. Lieutenant Marcus Ellison pressed his back against the crumbling wall, counting their remaining ammunition in his head. 9 rounds between them. The extraction window had closed 30 minutes ago. Outside, Shkodra's men were closing in, their shadows visible through the bullet-riddled walls. Then it appeared, a single red dot dancing on the steel beam above their heads. The crimson pinpoint swayed slightly in the wind that whistled through the shattered windows. Every fighter in the room froze, eyes locked on that telltale harbinger of death. One of Shkodra's men noticed it first, his eyes widening in recognition. The paramilitary soldier raised his hand in warning to his comrades. But it was already too late. The crack of a high-powered rifle split the air, and the man crumpled to the floor, a precision shot through his shoulder, disabling, not killing. "Sniper!" someone shouted, and chaos erupted anew. 3 more shots followed in rapid succession, each finding its mark with surgical precision. The enemy fighters scrambled for cover, their coordinated assault dissolving into confusion. None of the shots were fatal, each carefully placed to incapacitate rather than kill. "That's not our backup," Marcus breathed, recognition dawning in his eyes. He knew that shooting pattern, that restraint. Only one person he'd ever met could make those shots with such calculated mercy. Blaze looked up from his position by the window, pain momentarily forgotten as hope flickered across his face. "Who the hell is helping us?" The red dot continued its deadly dance, appearing and vanishing as more shots rang out from somewhere in the highlands above. The SEAL team seized the opportunity, repositioning themselves and reclaiming tactical advantage. Through his scope, Marcus caught a fleeting glimpse of a figure on the ridge, just a shadow against the darkening sky. But it was enough. Illyra Drachet had broken her vow of nonviolence. "Someone I never thought I'd see again," he answered quietly, checking his weapon. Outside, the paramilitaries were retreating, falling back to regroup. The red dot had vanished, but its message remained clear. The SEALs were no longer alone. "Whoever they are," Blaze said, gripping his injured leg as he reloaded his weapon. "I'm buying them a drink, if we make it out of here." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. Illyra's appearance meant something had changed. Something significant enough to draw her back into the violence she had sworn to leave behind. And that worried him more than Shkodra's men ever could. The night air hung heavy with fog as the SEALs abandoned the compromised safe house, moving in staggered formation through the darkness. Marcus Ellison led from the front, his face taut with concentration as he navigated by memory and instinct. Behind him, 2 team members supported Blaze, whose fractured legs slowed their progress but not his determination. "Wait," whispered Lyra Krasnicki, pulling a worn piece of paper from her pocket. "There's something you need to hear." She recited a children's folktale about a fox outsmarting wolves by using underground passages. To most ears, it was merely a story, but Illyra caught her cousin's eyes, recognizing the coded message within the seemingly innocent narrative. "The eastern tunnels," Illyra murmured. "Cold War escape routes. They'll lead us to higher ground." The team descended into the mountain's forgotten arteries, narrow passages carved decades ago when Albania had prepared for invasion that never came. Their flashlights cast eerie shadows against damp walls marked with faded Cyrillic numbers and arrows. The air was stale, thick with history and secrets. "Not exactly 5-star accommodations," Blaze joked through gritted teeth, his humor a thin veil over pain as they navigated the cramped space. After an hour of careful progress, they emerged onto a hillside shrouded in mist. Above them loomed the silhouette of an Orthodox monastery. Its stone walls weathered by centuries of mountain storms, the structure stood like a sentinel against the night sky, windows dark and bell towers silent. "We can secure the perimeter before dawn," Marcus said, scanning the approach with his night vision equipment. "Shkodra's men won't expect us to move uphill." Inside the monastery, dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights. Religious icons gazed down from cracked plaster walls, their gold leaf dulled by time. The team established a defensive position, setting Blaze up with communications equipment in what had once been the abbot's quarters. It was Illyra who discovered the hidden room behind the altar. "Marcus," she called softly, her fingers tracing a seam in the stonework. "Help me with this." Together they pushed against the wall, revealing a chamber that hadn't seen light in decades. Inside lay rows of wooden crates stamped with Soviet markings, a Cold War arsenal preserved in darkness and silence. AK-47s, RPGs, ammunition, Marcus cataloged as they pried open the crates. Still functional after all these years. Illyra lifted an old sniper rifle, her fingers automatically checking its mechanism. "These weapons have been waiting for another war," she said quietly. "In these mountains, conflicts never truly end, they just hibernate." The team distributed the weapons, each member understanding the grim irony of their salvation coming from a forgotten conflict. As dawn approached, they prepared for what would come next, knowing that like these relics of past wars, they too had been awakened to fight again. The ancient code of Gokmarja hung over the Albanian mountains like an invisible storm cloud. General Nikola Shkodra paced before his men, his weathered face illuminated by firelight as he recounted the blood debt owed by foreigners who had violated their sacred land. This wasn't merely a military operation for him, it was justice according to laws that predated any modern nation. "My grandfather's blood remains in this soil," the general told his lieutenants, tracing a line across his throat. "The Americans think their technology and treaties matter here. They forget that our memories are longer than their wars." Inside the monastery, Marcus Ellison struggled to understand the tactical situation. Every standard operating procedure seemed to fall apart in this terrain, where ancient codes superseded military logic. "It's not just about capturing us," Illyra explained, her voice low as she cleaned her rifle. "Shkodra believes his family honor demands your blood. Once Gokmarja is declared, it doesn't end until someone dies or formal reconciliation occurs." Blaze shifted uncomfortably on his makeshift bed, So we're dealing with a vendetta, not a mission? More complicated than that, the former sniper replied. His father was killed during NATO operations 15 years ago. The Alliance called it collateral damage. He calls it murder. Marcus ran his hand through his hair. Our intel never mentioned this. Your intelligence rarely accounts for blood feuds, Illyra said. But there's another code that might save us. Bessa. She explained how Bessa, the Albanian promise of protection and hospitality, was equally binding. If someone offered them sanctuary under this oath, even Shkodra would hesitate to violate it directly. Lyra nodded from her position by the window. My grandmother's family protected Jews during World War II because of Bessa. They would have died before breaking their word. The guide's eyes darted nervously outside. Her divided loyalties were becoming increasingly apparent to everyone. So we need someone to invoke this protection for us? Marcus asked. Yes, but it comes with responsibility, Illyra warned. If we accept Bessa, we're bound to protect them in return. It's not a tactical advantage, it's a sacred bond. The team fell silent, processing this moral complexity. Their training had prepared them for combat decisions, not navigating centuries-old honor systems where the wrong word could be as deadly as a bullet. We're not just fighting Shkodra's men, Illyra continued. We're fighting against traditions that have survived empires, communism, and everything in between. As night deepened, the SEAL team realized they were trapped between two unyielding codes, the blood vengeance that hunted them and the promise of protection that might save them. Each demanding absolute loyalty, and each carrying consequences that extended far beyond their mission parameters. The ancient wooden table creaked under the weight of steaming dishes, the candlelight casting long shadows across the faces of enemies forced into temporary peace. The Mountain family had opened their home to both the Americans and Shkodra's men, invoking the sacred Albanian code of hospitality that transcended even the bitterest of conflicts. No blood could be spilled under this roof, a tradition older than any of their modern grievances. Lieutenant Marcus Ellison sat rigidly, his back to the wall, eyes constantly scanning the room. Across from him, two of Shkodra's lieutenants maintained equally vigilant postures, their fingers never straying far from concealed weapons. The family's eldest daughter poured raki into small glasses, her hands steady despite the tension thick enough to choke on. To health, the patriarch announced in halting English, raising his glass. Everyone drank, the burning liquid a momentary distraction from the silent war of glares. Blaze attempted to lighten the mood with a compliment about the food, his injured leg propped awkwardly against a stool. The family smiled politely, but the atmosphere remained suffocating. Under the table, Lyra's foot tapped a nervous rhythm against the floorboards, her eyes darting between her plate and the door. Later, in the monastery's eastern corridor, Marcus found Illyra staring through a narrow window at the moonlit valley. The stone walls around them seemed to amplify their breathing in the silence. You still check your 6 before you sleep, she observed without turning. Some habits never change. He stepped closer, careful to maintain distance. Neither does your tendency to disappear when things get complicated. The soldier watched her profile harden in the dim light. 5 years had passed since NATO training in Germany, since the night she'd vanished after the mission report that branded her a liability. The official story, a civilian casualty during her watch, had been manufactured to protect political interests, but the damage was done before he could intervene. I didn't have a choice, Illyra whispered, finally meeting his gaze. They made me into something I couldn't live with. I should have fought harder for you. Her fingers traced old bullet scars in the monastery wall. We were different people then. I believed in systems. You believed in orders. The distant laughter from the dinner table filtered through the corridor, the bizarre normalcy of enemies breaking bread under ancient rules of respect. Tomorrow they would try to kill each other again, but tonight, centuries of tradition held them in check. And now? Marcus asked. Alira's eyes reflected something both familiar and foreign. Now I just believe in surviving until morning. She brushed past him, her shoulder barely touching his, and maybe in red dots appearing exactly when they're needed most. The bonfires of Dita Everest dotted the valley like fallen stars, their orange glow punctuating the darkness. Marcus Ellison signaled to his team as drums and celebratory shouts echoed from below, providing perfect cover for their escape. The ancient monastery walls, their temporary sanctuary, now felt like a closing trap. "Move now," he whispered, leading the seals through a crumbling archway. Blaze limped behind, his fractured leg barely supporting his weight, despite the makeshift splint Arda had fashioned from monastery relics. Spring's arrival had brought more than just the traditional Albanian festival. The mountain snow was melting rapidly, turning familiar trails into rushing streams and rendering their planned escape route impassable. The water thundered down slopes that had been navigable just days earlier. "The lower path is gone," Lyra announced, her voice tight with frustration as they reached a ledge overlooking what had been a trail but was now a torrent of muddy water. "We need another way." As if summoned by their desperation, a small figure emerged from behind a cluster of rocks. No more than 12 years old, the boy carried a wooden staff nearly twice his height. "You seek dry paths?" he asked in halting English, eyes darting between their faces. "Zeph," Lyra explained. "He herds goats in these mountains." The shepherd boy nodded solemnly. "I know ways, old ways. Follow." Trusting their lives to a child seemed foolish, but alternatives were scarce. Zeph led them along narrow ledges and through crevices barely visible to the untrained eye. The paths were ancient, worn smooth by generations of shepherds and their flocks. Meanwhile, Elira Dreshag worked alone, having separated from the group hours earlier. The abandoned NATO signal tower stood like a skeletal sentinel on a distant ridge. Inside, cobwebs draped the forgotten equipment, but the former sniper's fingers moved with practiced precision, bypassing security protocols she once helped design. Static crackled through the receiver as she intercepted Shkodra's communications. Her breath caught as the general's voice emerged, discussing operations with clinical detachment. Villages burned, civilians displaced, all blamed on NATO forces. "False flag," she whispered, the realization hitting her like physical pain. He's creating his own justification. The communication revealed something worse. Shkodra wasn't just fighting a local battle. He was manufacturing evidence to draw larger powers into conflict, using doctored footage and staged massacres. When Elira rejoined the group at dawn, her face was ashen. Marcus recognized that look, the same expression she'd worn years ago when missions crossed moral lines. "It's worse than we thought," she told them, voice barely audible over the rushing water nearby. "Shkodra isn't just hunting us. He's trying to start a war." The shepherd boy watched them with ancient eyes as the SEALs processed this revelation. Their mission had transformed from survival to something far more urgent, preventing a regional conflict built on calculated lies. "How much time?" Marcus asked. Elira's gaze met his. "Not enough." The stone walls of the makeshift prison cell seemed to close in around Arta Dreshai. Her captors had stripped her of medical supplies, but not her resolve. General Shkodra himself conducted the interrogation, his weathered face inches from hers as he demanded information about the Americans. "You're more than a village doctor," he growled, tossing a faded photograph onto the table between them. "NATO Operation Silverback, 2009. Arda's composure faltered for just a moment, enough to confirm his suspicions. The compassionate healer had once been something else entirely, a covert NATO medical officer, trained to operate behind enemy lines during regional conflicts. Years ago, she had erased her records, buried that life, and returned to her homeland to heal rather than enable war. "Those skills could serve our cause," the general offered, his voice softening deceptively. Your cousin made her choice. You can make yours. The medic remained silent, knowing her dual identity made her valuable, too valuable to kill, but dangerous enough to keep imprisoned. Each passing hour, she mentally cataloged potential escape routes, while treating wounded fighters brought to her cell. Every bandage she applied bought her intelligence. Every splint she created earned a small measure of trust. Miles away, chaos erupted as Lyra Kresnicki led the SEAL team through a narrow ravine. Gunfire exploded from the ridge above. Shkodra's men had found them. In the confusion, a lone figure broke from the enemy position, sliding down the scree slope toward them. "Hold fire!" Lyra screamed, recognizing her brother's slight frame. The 17-year-old conscript had finally found his chance to defect. Marcus Ellison signaled the team to provide covering fire as the boy scrambled toward them. 20 yards from safety, the teenager froze, his eyes widening in terror. He turned and sprinted back toward the enemy position. "Arbin," Lyra called out, her voice breaking. "What are you doing?" The firefight intensified as the SEALs pulled her to cover. Blaze dragged himself behind a boulder, grimacing through his pain to return fire. They retreated in stages, Lyra fighting them every step of the way, desperate to go after her brother. Only when they reached temporary safety did she discover the message on her communication device. A voice recording sent moments before the ambush. "They have father," her brother's voice trembled. "Don't come for me. They're watching. They'll kill him if I leave." Lyra collapsed against a tree trunk, silent tears streaming down her face as the recording continued. "Tell the Americans what they need to know. I'll be okay." The guide's sobs echoed through the forest as Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, understanding all too well how quickly allegiances could unravel when family hung in the balance. The monastery's stone walls trapped the night's chill, but Alira Dreshog barely noticed as she paced the narrow corridor. Her fingers traced the rough-hewn surface, mind racing between who she had been and who she'd fought to become. 5 years of carefully constructed peace dismantled in 48 hours. "You can't keep avoiding this conversation," Marcus said, his voice low as he approached from the shadows. The team leader looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, betraying sleepless nights. "There's nothing to discuss," she replied, turning away. "I made my choice when I pulled that trigger yesterday." Marcus stepped closer. "That's not what I mean. The files, Alira. The mission records." She stiffened. "What files?" "Everything about your last operation was classified and uploaded to a NATO satellite archive. Nothing exists on paper anymore." He hesitated. "I've seen them." The revelation hit her like ice water. "And you kept this from me? All this time? I was trying to protect you," he said, reaching for her arm. She pulled away. "From what, exactly?" His eyes met hers. "From knowing you were right all along. That civilian wasn't a casualty of your shot. It was staged. NATO needed a reason to extract you without revealing the real target." Alira pressed her back against the cold wall, breath catching. 5 years of guilt, of nightmares, of rebuilding her life around atonement, all based on a lie. "Who authorized it?" she whispered. "The same people who sent us here now. They knew you'd never leave willingly." Outside, dawn was breaking over the Albanian mountains. The former sniper moved to the narrow window, watching light creep across the valley where she'd grown up, where she'd learned to kill and later to heal. "They want me back," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. Marcus stood beside her. "They never stopped wanting you back. This mission," he paused, "I think we're the bait to draw you out." The realization settled between them, heavy as stone. Alira slipped away without another word, making her way down the monastery's crumbling steps to the highlands beyond. At the stone cross, where she'd retrieved her sniper kit days before, she knelt in the damp earth. From her pack, she withdrew a broken rifle, the one she'd used on her last mission. With trembling hands, she dug a shallow hole and placed the weapon inside, covering it with soil and fallen leaves. As she pressed the final handful of dirt over her past, Illyra understood the terrible truth. Burying the rifle wouldn't bury what she was becoming again. The shadows were calling her back, and this time there might be no return. When she finally rejoined the others, something in her eyes had changed. Marcus noticed immediately, but said nothing. Some transformations needed no words. Neil Blaze Jordan winced as he shifted his weight against the cold stone wall of the monastery tunnel. The fracture in his leg throbbed mercilessly, but his hands remained steady as he worked. Despite being written off as combat ineffective, the SEAL had spent the last 3 hours meticulously rigging an intricate alarm system using fishing line, empty shell casings, and parts salvaged from their damaged communication equipment. "If they come through here, we'll have about 90 seconds of warning," he whispered to Marcus, who crouched beside him reviewing the crude schematics. "Not much, but better than nothing." Lieutenant Ellison nodded grimly. It might be the difference between life and death tonight. He glanced at Blaze's notebook, its pages filled with hastily sketched escape routes, contingency plans, and defensive positions, all illustrated in the petty officer's distinctive comic book style. What had once seemed like an odd quirk now represented their best hope for survival. "Your artistic skills might save our asses," Marcus added, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. In the adjacent chamber, Arta Dreshai worked by lamplight, her skilled hands stitching a wound on the shoulder of a resistance fighter. The man's companions watched warily, their allegiance to the Americans tenuous at best. Since her escape from Shkodra's forces, the doctor had become both their greatest asset and liability. Her medical expertise had convinced the local resistance cell to provide temporary sanctuary, but her connection to NATO made her, and by extension, everyone around her, a priority target. "This will hold," she told the fighter in Albanian, tying off the last suture. "But you need antibiotics." She reached for her dwindling supply of medications, painfully aware that each pill dispensed was one less for future emergencies. The resistance leader, a weathered man known only as Besnik, approached Marcus. "My men will watch the eastern approach tonight," he said in halting English. "But we cannot stay beyond morning. Shkodra has informants everywhere." Illyra observed the exchange from the shadows, her face unreadable. The temporary alliance felt like walking on ice. Any misstep could plunge them all into disaster. She caught her cousin's eye across the room, recognizing the exhaustion etched into Arta's features. "We need to move before dawn," Illyra said quietly to Marcus when Besnik had departed. "Their loyalty is to survival, not to us." Outside, the wind howled through the ancient stone corridors, masking the sounds of movement. In the darkest hour before dawn, Blaze's improvised alarm suddenly triggered, a soft, rhythmic tapping that only the SEALs had been trained to recognize. The nighttime ambush they had feared was coming. As the team silently took their positions, Blaze clutched his notebook, the roadmap of their survival when all other options had collapsed. The monastery shadows concealed friend and foe alike, every alliance forged in the crucible of desperation, every breath potentially their last. The mountain wind carried whispers of a coming storm as Marcus Ellison and Illyra found themselves alone in the monastery's bell tower. Rain tapped against ancient stone, nature's metronome counting the moments until dawn. Their breath formed small clouds in the cold air between them. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "About Pristina, about why you left." Illyra's fingers tightened around her rifle. She'd spent years burying those memories, yet here they were, unearthed, like the sniper kit she'd promised never to touch again. "The civilian casualty report, it was fabricated," he continued, unable to meet her eyes. "NATO needed a scapegoat to protect certain political alliances. You were convenient. The revelation hung between them like smoke. Illyra turned away, her silhouette sharp against the gray sky. "I lived with that guilt for 5 years," she whispered. "I changed everything about my life because of it." Below them, Blaze kept watch, his injured leg propped against a wooden crate. The rest of the team slept fitfully, unaware of the truth unraveling above. "I tried to fight it," Marcus said, "but by the time I learned the truth, you'd vanished. No trace." "That was the point," Illyra replied. The first drops of rain splashed against her face, indistinguishable from tears. "I became someone else." A sudden realization dawned on her face. This mission, it was never about intelligence gathering, was it? Marcus's silence confirmed her suspicion. "They sent you to extract me," she said, the pieces falling into place. "I'm the asset." "Not just you," he admitted. "What you know about the Balkan operation, what you saw before they made you the fall person." Illyra laughed bitterly. "So you're the bait." "Looks that way," he agreed, a humorless smile crossing his face. Their eyes met, truly seeing each other for the first time in years, not as former lovers, but as two people shaped by the same broken system, carrying different wounds from the same war. "What now?" she asked. "We survive," Marcus answered simply. "Then we decide what truth deserves to see daylight." From below, Blaze called up softly, "Movement in the Eastern Valley." The lieutenant nodded, their personal reckoning postponed by necessity. As they descended the narrow stairs, their shoulders brushed, a small contact that spoke volumes. They were no longer who they had been to each other, but something new was forming in the crucible of danger, a partnership forged in shared betrayal and mutual respect. Outside, Shkodra's forces were closing in, unaware that their quarry now had something more dangerous than weapons: the truth. The freezing fog clung to the Valbona Pass like a shroud, turning the Albanian mountain ridge into a ghostly landscape. "Lieutenant," Marcus Ellison pressed his back against the damp stone wall of the tunnel, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The SEALs had retreated underground, the smell of gunpowder and limestone filling their nostrils as they prepared for what might be their final stand. "Blaze, what's our ammo situation?" Marcus whispered, glancing at Neil Jordan, whose face was etched with pain despite his attempts to mask it with his usual humor. 3 magazines each, 2 grenades, and enough prayers to fill a church," Blaze replied, wincing as he shifted his injured leg. "Unless you count the rusty AK we salvaged from that Cold War cache." Outside, General Nikola Shkodra's forces were regrouping. The team could hear the distant crackle of radio communications echoing across the valley. Intelligence suggested the paramilitary leader had called in reinforcements from the eastern valleys, tightening the noose around their position. Illyra Dreshai appeared like a shadow from the deeper recesses of the tunnel, her face smudged with dirt and determination. "They've positioned snipers on 3 ridges," she reported, kneeling beside Marcus. "The fog gives us some cover, but it won't last once the morning sun burns it off." Lyra Kresniki studied the crude map they'd sketched on the tunnel wall. "There's a shepherd's path that cuts through the western slope," the guide suggested, her voice tight with anxiety. "But it passes too close to the village. If we engage there, civilian casualties become inevitable," Marcus finished, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. "Not an option." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant echo of boots on stone as Shkodra's men moved into position. Every sanctuary was compromised, every escape route blocked or too dangerous to risk. The traditional code of Besa that might have protected them in a village home wouldn't extend to these tunnels. "We could split up," Blaze suggested, his fingers absently tracing patterns in his notebook. "Create multiple targets." Illyra shook her head. "In these mountains, divided means conquered. Shkodra knows every crevice, every cave, A muffled explosion rocked the tunnel entrance, sending dust and small rocks cascading from the ceiling. The standoff had begun. "They're testing our defenses," Marcus said, checking his communication device one last time. No signal, no extraction, no miracle. The team exchanged glances in the dim light of their single lamp. Each face told the same story: exhaustion, determination, and the grim acceptance that this mountain pass might be their final resting place. "Whatever happens," Marcus said, chambering around in his weapon, "we hold this position until we can't. No one gets taken alive." As they moved toward the tunnel entrance, the eerie stillness of the mountain seemed to hold its breath. In the deadly game of cat and mouse that had brought them to this moment, they were finally cornered. And cornered predators were the most dangerous of all. The mountain air crackled with gunfire as Lyra Krasniki made her choice. "This way," she whispered, leading the battered SEAL team through a narrow crevice hidden behind dense foliage. Her knowledge of these highlands, paths walked since childhood, was now fully committed to their survival. Each step away from the paramilitaries was another step away from her brother, somewhere among Shkodr's ranks. The weight of this sacrifice carved lines into her face as she pressed forward. "We've got movement on our 6, Marcus warned, his voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the rocks. The lieutenant signaled for the team to take defensive positions while Blaze, despite his injured leg, retrieved a small device from his pocket. "Remember that little surprise I left behind?" Blaze's usual humor was strained but present. The alarm trap he'd rigged in the monastery tunnels now served its purpose, drawing Shkodr's men in the wrong direction as false signals triggered across their communication devices. The diversion bought them precious minutes. The team scrambled up a nearly vertical path, using roots and rock formations as handholds. Neil winced with each movement, but refused assistance, determination overriding pain. From her concealed position 200 meters above, Alira tracked their progress through her scope. The familiar weight of the rifle felt like a betrayal of everything she'd built since leaving her military past behind. For 3 years, she'd lived by a vow of nonviolence, tending to her small garden and avoiding conflict. Now, the cold metal against her cheek was a homecoming she'd never wanted. When the paramilitary scout appeared on the ridge above Blaze, Alira had less than a second to decide. The shot echoed across the valley, clean, precise, fatal. The scout collapsed without a sound, tumbling down the slope away from the SEALs. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, breath coming in short gasps. Alira pressed herself against the rocky ground as memories flooded back, faces of those she'd killed years ago, missions that had hollowed her soul. The panic attack gripped her chest like a vice, threatening to expose her position as she fought for control. Below, Marcus looked up toward the source of the shot, somehow sensing her struggle. Their eyes didn't meet, couldn't across that distance, but something passed between them nonetheless. Understanding, gratitude, regret. "We need to keep moving," Lyra urged, her voice breaking. "The northern passage won't stay clear for long." As the group continued their desperate journey, Elira gathered her equipment with trembling fingers. Each piece she packed away represented another thread of her carefully constructed piece unraveling. The woman who had planted herbs and meditated at dawn was disappearing with each tactical decision, each calculated risk. The cost of survival hung heavy in the mountain air, measured in abandoned brothers, broken vows, and the slow erosion of who they'd all tried to become. The truth struck like a thunderbolt in the cramped tunnel beneath the monastery. Marcus Ellison stood rigid, his face illuminated by the dim glow of Blaze's tactical light as he finally admitted what he'd known all along. The intel retrieval was never the mission, he confessed, voice barely audible over the distant rumble of Shkodra's vehicles. "NATO wants you, Illyra. You're the last living link to Operation Blackstone. The operation was supposed to be buried forever, but someone's digging. Illyra dressage, face hardened into a mask of betrayal. So I was the target all along? My cousin's capture, this entire mess? It was all to flush me out? Her fingers tightened around her rifle, knuckles whitening. The woman who had vowed never to return to violence now couldn't escape it. Blaze looked between them. His usual humor evaporated. "Command played us," he muttered, wincing as he shifted his injured leg. "Used us as bait to draw her out." Lyra, who had been monitoring the tunnel entrance, rushed back with panic in her eyes. "Shkodra's men are moving into position. They've found the western exit." The revelation fractured what little unity remained. The SEAL team exchanged glances loaded with doubt. Their mission parameters suddenly hollow. Their purpose on foreign soil questionable at best. Trust, already fragile in these mountains, now seemed as thin as the frigid air above. "It doesn't matter now," Marcus said, his training overriding personal feelings. "We need to move. The extraction point is 2 kilometers east, across the old stone bridge." Illyra's laugh was bitter. "The bridge Shkodra has rigged to blow? The one surrounded by his men?" She shook her head. "NATO used you to get to me, and now they'll leave us all to die." The team fell silent, the weight of betrayal settling over them like the mountain itself. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. "I didn't know," Marcus whispered, reaching for her arm. "Not until we landed, I swear it." She pulled away. "It doesn't matter what you knew. What matters is what we do now." Lyra checked her watch. "The extraction helicopter will only wait 5 minutes." "If we miss it, we won't," Blaze interrupted, determination replacing disillusionment. "We didn't come this far to die in some political crossfire." The group gathered their meager supplies, years of training overriding their sense of betrayal. There would be time for reckoning later, if they survived. "Ready?" Marcus asked, looking at each face in turn. Illyra nodded grimly, chambering around. "Let's go remind NATO why they wanted me in the first place." With Shkodra's forces closing in from 3 sides and their only escape route rigged to explode, they moved toward the tunnel exit, unity forged not by loyalty to command, but by the simple, primal need to survive. The wind howled through the Valbona Pass as Illyra dressage steadied her breathing. 400 meters away stood the bridge, their only escape route, and simultaneously their greatest vulnerability. Through her scope, she watched General Shkodra's men positioning explosives along the weathered support beams. "They're going to blow it before extraction arrives," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The lieutenant's face was etched with exhaustion, a far cry from the confident commander she had known years ago. And Lyra's fingers tightened around her rifle. "There's another way." Her voice was hollow, knowing what her words truly meant. Blaze looked up from where he sat, propped against a boulder, his injured leg stretched awkwardly before him. "What other way? That bridge is our only ticket home." The former sniper pointed to the fuel tanks the paramilitaries had carelessly stacked near their position. "One shot, I can trigger a chain reaction that will collapse the bridge on our terms, not theirs." Marcus immediately understood. "You'd be cutting yourself off. The helicopter can't extract all of us from both sides." "I know these mountains," she replied, the weight of her decision settling in her chest. "You don't." Lyra, who had been silent until now, touched Illyra's arm. "My brother might still be with them. If you stay, I'll find him," Illyra promised, though they both knew it might be impossible. The radio crackled with the extraction team's voice. "Eagle 1, we have a 10-minute window. Bridge or no extraction. Over." Marcus locked eyes with Illyra, unspoken words passing between them. He had failed her once before. The thought of leaving her behind again tore at him. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said simply. "Get your team ready." As the SEAL team prepared for extraction, Illyra positioned herself on the ridge. Through her scope, she found the perfect angle, one shot to trigger the fuel tanks, which would collapse the bridge's weakest point. The mathematics of destruction, a skill she had hoped never to use again. The helicopter appeared as a black speck against the gray sky. Time had run out. "Go," she whispered into her radio. The SEALs made their desperate dash across the bridge as Shakodra's forces opened fire. Alira took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. The bridge buckled, concrete and steel twisting as it collapsed into the ravine below. The helicopter swooped in, hovering precariously as the team scrambled aboard. Marcus was the last to board, his eyes scanning the mountainside for any sign of her. But Alira had already disappeared into the shadows, her rifle slung across her back, moving deeper into the territory she knew would now become both her prison and her sanctuary. The bridge fell with a thunderous finality, and with it, any chance of following her. The air in the military hospital corridor felt sterile and unforgiving as Marcus Ellison stared at the ceiling. Memories of Albania flooding back with each beep of the monitoring equipment. His team had made it home, but none of them were the same men who had parachuted into those mountains 3 weeks ago. "The debrief is tomorrow," he told Blaze, who sat in a wheelchair beside him, his fractured leg elevated and wrapped in a cast covered with crude drawings. Neil Jordan merely nodded, his usual jokes absent in the weight of their shared experience. "I'm telling them everything," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "About NATO's real objective. About Alira." The truth had become his only path to redemption, a way to honor the woman who had saved them all before disappearing back into the shadows. Across the Atlantic, Arta Dreshaj moved cautiously through the refugee camp, her medical bag clutched tightly. The doctor's release had been negotiated through channels she didn't fully understand, but she recognized the invisible hand of her cousin in the arrangement. 3 new resistance groups now sought her medical expertise, drawn by stories of her courage under Shkodra's interrogation. Yet each alliance came with risk. Her NATO past remained a liability that could resurface at any moment. In a small cafe overlooking the valley, Lira Krasniki served coffee to travelers, her ears alert for any whisper of her brother. The guide had established a network of informants, farmers, shepherds, merchants, all watching for a young man trying to find his way home. Some nights, she replayed his final message until the words blurred with her tears. "Don't come for me." But she would never stop looking. On a hillside where goats grazed, Zeph proudly showed his friends the compass that the American soldier had pressed into his small hands. "He said it always points to home," the shepherd boy explained, turning the instrument carefully in his palm. The metal caught the sunlight, sending a brief flash across the valley, a small reminder that connections forged in crisis endure. In a windowless room in Brussels, NATO officials reviewed satellite footage, communication logs, and mission reports. Questions multiplied. Why had a simple extraction become a firefight? Who had leaked the landing coordinates? And most puzzling, who was the woman with the sniper rifle who appeared in exactly 4 frames of drone footage before vanishing completely? Marcus stood at his apartment window that night, watching the city lights below. He touched the small Albanian stone he now carried in his pocket, a piece of that mountain that had changed everything. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he could still see that single red dot appearing in the darkness, the moment when impossible hope had flickered back to life. Months passed since the extraction, but the mountains of northern Albania kept their vigil. Legends began to form in villages nestled between ancient peaks, whispered tales of a guardian who appeared when all hope seemed lost. Some called her a ghost. Others believed she was merely a story told to comfort children. But for those who had witnessed the red dot dancing across stone walls seconds before impossible shots saved lives, she was very real. Marcus Ellison sat behind his desk at Naval Special Warfare Command, staring at the official report he'd submitted. The sanitized version mentioned nothing of Alira Dreshaj or the true nature of their mission. The lieutenant ran his fingers over the scar on his forearm, a permanent reminder of the woman who had vanished into the highlands, rather than abandon her homeland. In a remote clinic near the Valbona Pass, Arta continued her work, treating shepherds and villagers alike. The doctor never spoke of her cousin, yet sometimes patients noticed how she would pause and glance toward the window when distant gunfire echoed across the valley. Her silence was both protection and prayer. Blaise had returned to active duty, his leg healed, but his perspective forever altered. The SEAL kept a small notebook filled with Albanian phrases, studying them during quiet moments between deployments. His teammates never asked why. NATO intelligence files recorded 3 separate incidents where local resistance fighters, cornered by remnants of Shkodran's forces, reported miraculous escapes. Each account mentioned the same detail: a single red dot appearing moments before their pursuers fell. Lira Krasniki now worked as a guide for humanitarian organizations, leading aid workers through treacherous mountain passes. She left small caches of supplies at predetermined locations: medicine, ammunition, batteries for communication devices. They always disappeared overnight, taken by unseen hands. In a shepherd's hut high above the tree line, Zeph proudly showed visitors the compass given to him by the American soldier. The boy claimed it always pointed toward safety, not north. Few believed him until they found themselves lost in sudden mountain fog, only to spot a reflection, a tiny crimson point of light guiding them to shelter. General Shkodran's remaining loyalists spoke in hushed tones of a demon that haunted the highlands, picking them off one by one. They fired at shadows and jumped at echoes, their fear growing with each unexplained disappearance from their ranks. And somewhere in those ancient mountains, Alira watched through her scope, her finger steady on the trigger. When desperate voices whispered, "God help us," into the wind, she answered, unseen, unthanked, and undaunted. The mountains kept their secrets, and she had become one with them, a guardian whose presence was known only by a single red dot and the silence that followed.